Director of First Year Writing. It's my pleasure today to introduce Kay Halasek, our speaker. Kay was Associate Professor of English and Director of Second Year Writing at Ohio State University. She received her BA from Georgetown, her MA from Woodland, Arizona, and her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. She's the author of, and editor and co-author in many publicated arrangements, many books. Most prominently for our purposes, she's the author of A Pedagogy of Possibility, Lactinian perspective on composition studies, co-author of the HarperCollins A Brief Guide to Basic Writing, as well as the editor or co-editor of two major anthologies, landmark Essays on Basic Writing and Writing Lives, Reading Communities. Her recent articles are on topics as different as theorizing plagiarism in university. That's like really putting a lot of work on theorizing. I haven't actually read that one. I've read a couple of the others. I think it's just like bad they shouldn't copy. I have kind of primitive views. Yeah, okay. It's appeared in college English. Activism, Advocacy in English, and forthcoming A View from a MOOC, in a new collection of essays called, very forthrightly, The Invasion of the MOOCs. She's been a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Houston, and at her own university has been honored with, among others, both a Distinguished Teaching and a Distinguished Service Award. And here I get to say something that you almost never get to say in introductions in English departments, and I don't think I've ever got to say. She's been the recipient of numerous grants. I wasn't quite clear what the proper, like, what a recipient was, though I don't know. You know, I've never had grant and actually getting it in the same sentence. So I think recipient, I looked it up on Google. Recipient is the right way to say. She's a recipient of numerous grants, many from the state of Ohio and or Ohio State, and most recently, and this is actually a hard sentence for me to say, a post-secondary success grant from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. It's sort of like saying the devil is paying you to do what you do. But you know, you can have a kind of personal relation to the devil, it's okay. I'm really, really glad to welcome her today with all her money. And with the Gates devil working behind. And as given the promise made by the Gates Foundation and by the forthcoming article, her topic today is Remediating Pedagogy, a MOOC case study. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Kay Halasek.
Maybe I could start with, I do know the Nadia, so how do I begin from there? And I think maybe the first most important thing to say is Bill and Melinda Gates shelled out $50,000. Woo!
I just want to say though, a world in which that's not a lot of money is not our world.
I wouldn't be at the top of the list in the department of, say, computer science and engineering with that. But you're right, it is in fact the case that humanities professors and English professors in particular don't often see the kind of funding that we do from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, even in $50,000, which bought us a programmer. And by us, and this is perhaps a good way to start, there were 5 faculty members and 2 graduate students from Ohio State who, at the request of our Associate Provost and Dean of Undergraduate Studies, simply in the course of 1 week put together a grant application, submitted it to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, found out 4 weeks later that we had been funded. That was in November of 2012, and by April 2013, we had to begin offering the course and complete the offering of the course, the MOOC, by June. So we had all of about 9 months to create the course, develop all the materials for it, and then complete the work of the course. And for this, they gave us $50,000, which I said bought a programmer for us. And it bought a programmer for us who was very inexpensive but very good. He was a former graduate student in our math department at Ohio State, and it was really quite a godsend for us. And so I really did, I was trying to figure out and deliberate how to begin today, because I know MOOCs are very much a contested topic, particularly in the humanities. And I wanted to begin by simply saying I don't think MOOCs are either the future of or the end of higher education. And I hope that we can have a conversation about that a little bit. But I did want to begin by saying, in fact, my opening remarks before this morning when I woke up and checked my email, and I'll get to this a little bit later in the talk, were to relate sort of some information from from an email that I received a short time ago from my colleague, and I'm going to have to sign back in here, thanks to Ohio State. So I'm not to stray too far from my computer. From Louis Allman, and it's like almost on a daily basis I'm getting emails from colleagues saying, oh, look, here's another bit on MOOCs and so forth. And so this morning I received one from Rebecca Burnett at Georgia Tech University, who related to me the contents of this particular report. And I simply and so I cut and pasted, did a screenshot, and simply cut and pasted some of the executive summary from this document, which was produced in Great Britain, that learning practitioners, as if we didn't know this, learning practitioners disagree about the value of MOOCs. But I wanted to put these issues out on the table to let you know that I realize these are contested topics and that MOOCs are a contested space. But a stranded enthusiasts welcomes the shake-up and the energy MOOCs bring to learning. And I would say, yeah, I'm really fascinated by what we can learn from MOOCs, what we can learn about MOOCs and bring back to our face-to-face classrooms. If you think about teaching writing at scale, or even getting, we had 37,000 individuals who enrolled in our MOOC, about 500 of whom completed the entire run of the course, submitting their pieces of writing. So we have a database now of that much writing of students, and of peer review in particular, which is going to be the focus of my conversation today. So I have all of these data now that I can use as points to begin to investigate what makes for what I'm calling strong tie learning in a classroom, as opposed to weak tie learning. Now, I borrow those terms from Malcolm Gladwell, but I use them in very different ways from Gladwell. So if you're familiar with those terms, I want to talk about strong tie learning as those ways that individuals, even in a digital space, begin to create community and begin to sort of enliven one another in the conversations they have. What we know from research into online education, not just MOOCs, but online education, is that students in synchronous situations, right, create community. Because, right, you're in fact talking with one another. But asynchronous technologies create deeper learning. Because if you think about this, you have more time to think about what you put on the discussion quizzes. So asynchronous learning creates more thoughtful learning. Synchronous technologies develop or build community a little bit. So we wanted to test that hypothesis. We wanted to test to see whether that in fact was the case in the MOOC, or whether it might be the case in our face-to-face or hybrid classrooms back in Ohio State. The skeptics are really concerned along two things. The supposed benefits were already realized in generations of online distance learning, and I would completely agree with that. I don't think MOOCs necessarily create any additional affordances beyond access. We had 37,000 individuals in the MOOC, and only about 30% of them were located in the United States. 70% of our participants came from overseas or were expats, U.S. citizens who were living abroad. And then the same figures stood for language. Only about 30% of the participants in the MOOC were first language speakers of English. Most of them were bi and multilingual individuals. And so this really changed the shape of how we understood the teaching of writing and how we undertake writing. But I did want to start here to acknowledge that I don't believe MOOCs will be the future of our education, nor are they going to be the end of our education. What is important from this particular document that Rebecca sent me this morning is that most of the individuals who participate in MOOCs, and I'm going to ask for some self-disclosure here. How many of you have been enrolled in MOOC? Not a single worker, not anyone who's willing to. I'm a MOOC dropout. I'm a dropout from MOOCulus, which is Ohio State calculus course. Mostly because calculus is not a strong suit for me. But what we do know is that in the reporting from MOOCs, the participants express a great deal of satisfaction with the experience that they have. And what I'm interested in doing is trying to figure out, right, through research, what are the ties, what are the ways, what are the elements, the technologies, the activities that are instrumental in coming up with this kind of experience, and how can I translate that back to my classrooms? And this is my critical point. I want to make this early on. So we didn't undertake the MOOC in order to envision a future for writing instruction that was in a MOOC, but to take what we could learn from all of these vast data to come back and inform our writing classrooms at the university. And so I'll focus today just then on peer review as one of the ways we're beginning. And that we is that group of seven, including Professors Scott DeWitt, Cindy Self, Ben McCorkle, Susan Delagrange, except for more, me, and then two graduate students from our program. I want to start also with guiding principles then. I'm working here from the work of Rich Haswell, and Rich is very interested in bringing back into English studies, into writing studies in particular, approach to research and research into pedagogy that engages in and employs research and principles that are replicable, aggregable, and data supported. We have, he argues, for many years, really turned away from quantitative, qualitative, empirical research in humanities and English studies, and he sees a real value in turning back to some of these approaches to grounded theory as a way of understanding our pedagogy. And he also, and he sees this as what he calls an ecumenical approach, and here I'm going to quote from Haswell. He wants us, Haswell, to think about how we can blend qualitative and quantitative methodologies, and here I'm quoting, bridging classroom practice and research inquiry, employing what Stephen Witty described as the logic of discovery and the logic of validation. The presentation that I'm going to be giving today, then the larger research program from which it stems, is one I want to situate within that tradition that Steve Witty defined for us and that Haswell describes. Investigation that is, again, replicable, aggregable, and data supported. I love that the acronym is RAD, right? So this is RAD approaches to research in pedagogy. That it's a best effort inquiry into the actualities of a situation, inquiry that is explicitly enough systematized to the sampling, execution, and analysis to be replicated. And I'm going to say replicated back in our face-to-face and hybrid classrooms. I'm not talking about replicating this in a MOOC environment. Maybe in an online environment, but exactly enough circumscribed to be extended and factually enough supported to be verified. We worked with grounded theory, constructivist grounded theory, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about our methodologies later if you'd be interested in hearing about them. What I'm going to be focusing on today then is peer review, what we see as a means of facilitating collaborative assessment in the classroom. We created, with the help of that programmer I mentioned to you, the Writers Exchange, which is an online anonymous system for pulling in for students to submit writing. It then is distributed across, in the case of MOOC, 37,000 students. In the case of a pilot study I'm involved in now, 70 students across 3 sections of writing. They pull their common assignments, they submit their assignments, and then they're distributed out for anonymous review by the peers across these 3 sections of secondary writing. But that is a system that is also supported by fairly intensive instruction in how to undertake a peer review. Because if you follow the arguments in the public sphere and in the academy about MOOCs, one of the concerns is, can peers legitimately grade one another? And one of the only mechanisms, if you're in a course where you have 37,000 individuals and they're submitting pieces of writing, the only real option is peer review and peer grading of one point or another, because I can't grade those or look at those 37,000 submissions that the students would give to us. I want to say that what we did in the course was create for the students, and let me also point out, as I'm doing this, on your handout today, if you're digitally inclined, you can use the QR code that's here on the front page and get a snapshot of it. And you can actually access all of the materials from the presentation, including the PowerPoint presentation, as well as some additional materials, including the WEX guide, which is the guide to peer review that we created for students. If you're not digitally inclined and don't want to use the QR code, you can simply go to the website, go.osu.edu/UIC, and all of the materials from my presentation and some additional materials will be available to you there. But I'm happy to also talk about how we instructed students in peer review. It's a fairly sophisticated system. In the end, what we asked students to to do was, and this is in the MOOC as well as in the hybrid course that I'm teaching now, describe, assess, and suggest. This was a consistent system, so the students were, again, given these kinds of directions. This is just a page or a portion of a page pulled from the peer review guide that we gave to them. And they were to follow this particular system on each of 3 criteria that we had identified for each of the writing assignments that the students had completed. We felt like if we could give them a framework, introduce them to norming and sampling student rating, that they would be more accustomed to, well, it's like portfolio assessment, more accustomed to the processes by which we come to understand and evaluate writing. And then in addition to the describe, assess, suggest, the participants in the MOOC and the students in our hybrid sections are asked to rate the essay on a scale of 1 to 5 on each of 3 different criteria. And I'll have some criteria up here in just a moment. So they get a numerical score as well as a discursive response to their peers' writing. And we typically ask them to do 3 to 5 responses to their peers' writing, so each individual would get what would be comparable to what we might do in a face-to-face classroom if we're doing peer-to-peer response in a face-to-face. So here's an example. These are the criteria from a public service announcement, which is one of the 3 assignments that students did in the MOOC as well as in our hybrid courses. So these are the criteria. They're just an example of the criteria that we might use to ask students to evaluate one another's work. So they would discuss, assess, suggest on each of these 3 criteria. They would give a numerical score on each of the 3 criteria and then give an overall score. Let me slip out of this for just a moment and give you a view of what this looks like. Oops. Give you a view of what this looks like. Shoot. There we go. And this is actually X. This is the peer review system that we're using, that we used in the work that we use now. So this is the title of the course and so forth. So I, as the instructor in the course, can go in. And I can look at the assignments. Oops, sorry, wrong tab. I can look at the analytics. I can look, for example, because the peer review system generates not just the discursive responses and the scores on each of the criteria, it actually generates analytics, discourse analytics on each of the pieces of writing. And so I can come in here, and this is, I'm not revealing anything here about individual students. These are aggregate scores on the 2nd writing assignment that students are doing this semester. So I can look at this critical synthesis essay. So I can look at, this is an N of 70, so we have 70 students roughly completing. So I can see, and these are the figures, so I remember the students have an overall score. They can give a 1 to a 5. So in the case of the 70 students in our course, this is the grade distribution, and I want to use sort of quotation marks around it because the students aren't actually grading one another. The scores that they give to their peers don't ever sort of become the basis for my grading of the papers. I will grade and review the revisions, but so these are first drafts. But it does give the writers a sense of where they fall on a scale relative to the other 60 students who are in our pilot section. So if I were a student in this course, I would have a red bar that would say appear here to show me where I stand relative to the other 69 students in my course across the courses. We also can look at something like reading ease. So, and this would actually is going to be critical to an example I'm going to be giving in a few minutes. We can actually look to see, this is the Flesch-King-Page reading score, and we sort of instruct students on what that means and so forth. But so the distribution here is a little narrower than it is, or grade level. And this was interesting to me for this critical synthesis that the majority of students were writing maybe characteristically at the 12th grade level or higher in their critical synthesis essays. But through the process of peer review, Nadia and Walter and I will have, let's say, Jennifer distributed our papers anonymously. We will report back scores. But then I have the opportunity to evaluate Nadia on helpfulness. So she sends in her describe, assess, suggest, right, to assessment of my piece of writing. And then as a writer, I have the opportunity to report back how helpful her responses were to me. And this is actually an element that we added after the MOOC. This wasn't part of it. This is an example of how I'm remediating my pedagogy in my face-to-face classroom based on the information and the experiences in the MOOC. Previous in the MOOC, you submitted your piece of writing, I got my score back, and that was sort of the end of the system, right? And the peer reviewers were really interested, and they lobbied us. They were very much interested in how their reviews were received. They wanted to continue the dialogue and the conversation. We've also added a reflective element to this too, not only give the helpfulness scores, but then reflect on what you received from your peers and then create a revision plan. And so that's another addition. Again, we're working from the MOOC, we're finding these data, we're reaching conclusions about what makes a more informed pedagogy and approach to peer review and implementing in our face-to-face classrooms. You would get very happy with this. But so this shows the distribution, right, on a scale again of 1 to 5. And we have some students whose peers indicated that their reviews were not particularly helpful. I think here, though, the N is only about 1, if I'm correct. Yes. So there's only one student who was at the sort of tail end of this particular system, or this particular scale. So we can also see, this is the PSA, the assignment that we actually showcasing here. We just looked into just a few minutes. Here the distribution is obviously spread out more. It's more, it ranges more broadly from 5 down to 2. So some students were not as ineffective. Peers felt that their work wasn't quite as sophisticated, didn't meet the objectives or the criteria as well as it did with the first assignment, which was a critical synthesis. A quick aside, peer review, as I mentioned earlier in discussions about MOOCs, is one of the most contentious sort of spaces of conversation. Can we train, or do we want to train? Should it be a goal for us to train or educate undergraduate students to read as if they were professors? And my answer to that is no. The value that a peer can give in response to a piece of writing isn't in grading, it's in responding. And this is one of the critical terms that I don't yet see in the public conversation about MOOCs and about peer grading. And it makes sense in a way if you think about, well, what's the only way to evaluate writing in a MOOC when we have 37,000 people? It's to give the students the responsibility for that. And I find that problematic. I don't think that the work of the students in any writing classroom, whether it's a MOOC or a face-to-face classroom with 15 to 24 students, should be to grade one another, should be to respond to one another. And so the peer system that we've created is one, really, I think that I'm imagining is part of this larger sort of surge in disciplines across academic areas, where we are turning to something like the peerage of science or pub peer, where we have scholars, right, academics working with one another to improve early drafts of scientific writing or other kinds of academic writing. So the question that's being framed in the public sphere and in academia about peer review, I think, is the wrong question to be asking. We really shouldn't be asking, can students grade in a valid or reliable fashion, right, relative to instructors, but what kinds of effective feedback can we give to one another? And for that reason, we never gave a rubric for the helpfulness scores. We gave students rubrics for the criterion-based assessment of the pieces of writing, but I didn't want to predict for students what was going to be helpful or unhelpful in a peer response. And so one of the points of data analysis for us is to look at the peer responses, right, to describe, assess, suggest, and begin to look at the data to see what kinds of responses were most helpful. What kind of peer response, either in terms of length, in terms of the content, in terms of the focus of that peer response, earned a higher helpfulness score, and what are the characteristics of unhelpful peer review? Again, my goal is not to see whether they read like instructors, right, or whether they can mimic our scores, but what makes for a helpful peer response, because I suspect that what the students in our classes see as helpful isn't necessarily the feedback that we would be giving them. And recommit things. Think about, they're on the WPA listserv right now, if any of you are on that, there's the Over Responders Anonymous thread. So, I mean, there is this thread but you may be on it anyway, but the Over Responders thread is, you know, we spend hours. I still, I have to confess, don't get under 30 minutes per paper in responding to a paper. I don't. And I wonder, you know, what is the trade-off of my labor and commentary if my students if they don't benefit from those comments? And I don't have any valid, reliable, data-driven evidence to tell me that what I have been doing for 30 years has it all been helpful to them. And I want to know. I want to know whether or whether the peer review that I use in classrooms, is it all helpful? We were at, Scott DeWitt and I, and one of our staff from the Office of Distance Education, we were at AACU in Portland 2 weeks ago. And we were presenting on this, and one of the folks who came up to talk with us said, oh yes, peer review, the thing we all do but everyone hates. And I think, well, you know, maybe we don't all hate it, but I think we do recognize that peer review doesn't work successfully in a lot of environments, whether it's a face-to-face class of 12 to 14 to 24, or whether it's in the MOOC. So we're really interested in seeing whether the MOOC data, this massive amount of data where we have peer reviews with helpfulness scores attached to them, can tell us anything that helpful that would then inform our own teaching. Here's an example, and this is actually from this semester's course, a peer review. Yeah, this is a great, I love this one. So, I mean, what you see behind so this is an anonymous peer review, as you might expect. But this is also not uncharacteristic of what students are both receiving, and it might not be uncharacteristic of what happens in a face-to-face classroom. But you can see here in the background is the criterion, and we just pulled out one particular element from this particular response. So the student in my class, actually the writer, not the peer reviewer, but the writer was a student in my class. We'll just call her Elizabeth. Elizabeth received this portion of the peer review on criteria, and you can see here on criterion 3 how well the writer composed a critical synthesis. The reviewer's score was a 2 out of 5. Okay, obviously very low, right? The reviewer was saying to Elizabeth, this is not a particularly successful piece of writing in terms of this particular criteria. And the student, not in my class, I will say, who gave the peer review and referred to Elizabeth's work as distractingly pretentious and scored it a 2, submits her peer review, and Elizabeth reads it. I was very, let me skip ahead, actually, and then I'll go back to the previous slide. Now, this is Elizabeth's reflection on the 3 peer reviews that she received for this same paper. So my last peer review noted that my writing style, I love that she actually quoted the passage, is distractingly pretentious. And a few others said it was difficult to read at times. Already I would say, look at the synthesis and personal reflection on her writing that she's already making. She steps back from the distractingly pretentious tone, which is incredibly problematic from my perspective as a teacher. I mean, my first impulse was to become very defensive on Elizabeth's behalf, right? When I saw this come through, but then I recognized, and this is where connectivist learning and constructivist learning comes in. Elizabeth, I needed to trust that Elizabeth, like a lot of the students in my classes, can deal with this. That I didn't need to step in, and I didn't step in, because this was all happening electronically before I even knew what was going on, right? Because I happened not to log in at a time when I could see these things happening. I needed to recognize that the students in our classes, and in my classes in particular, can handle these kinds of situations. They handle them all the time. And so Elizabeth did what I thought was a very mature kind of thing. I mean, she made a very mature kind of gesture. After reviewing the analytics and hearing from other people that my writing was difficult to read, I noticed I have a high rating for the average characters per word grade level in reading. So in other words, she looked at these criteria, right, on WEX in the peer review system, and she saw that while she might not agree that her writing was distractingly pretentious, and I don't have her view here, but she probably fell down here, right, on the Flesch-Kincaid reading score and toward the top of average characters per word. In fact, she did. She was in the 4.8 to 5-point scale. And she began to recognize that all of these data points together suggested to her that maybe, while not distractingly pretentious, there was something about her writing that was problematic for her readers and for the reviewers. And so she really, I felt, did a good job in analyzing this. And what's really compelling to me, oops, oh, I thought I had more stuff. Oh, I thought I had gone from this score here. I apparently didn't pull this slide up. But when she does her reflection, oh, it's not here. She gave this reviewer, the distractingly pretentious reviewer, a helpfulness score of 5. So she rated it as highly as she possibly could. She did the reflection first and then assigned the helpfulness scores. So she was able to step back from and separate a score of 2 and a sort of response that was problematic in its tone in assessing her writing, and recognize that there was a value to the peer review that she had gotten. So while I might have graded down a distractingly pretentious peer reviewer on quality of tone, what I realize now is that Elizabeth was able to step past that and to recognize the value in even a problematic approach or response to her. In terms of the MOOC, we have some initial findings and continuing questions. And some of these were very surprising to me. The first, the most highly skilled writers as judged by their peers are not those participants whose reviews are identified as the most helpful. The best writers don't make the best peer reviewers. There was no correlation at all. There was also no correlation between academic preparation and helpfulness scores. Most of the individuals in the MOOC held at least a bachelor's degree, and most of them held, and many of them held advanced degrees. About 80% of them already held bachelor's degrees. But there was no correlation between the degree, right, the number of degrees, or the advanced nature of the degrees and helpfulness scores. These are interesting data points for me. I can no longer step into a classroom if I were inclined to do that before to think that the good writers will make good peer reviewers, so I need to pair that really good writer with the not so skilled writer, because then this magic is going to take place and the not so skilled writer is going to benefit. Well, it's just as likely that the skilled writer is going to benefit from the commentary of the less skilled writer. And so this was something that was interesting to me because it tested one of my assumptions about teaching. And then participants who expressed a high degree of commitment to peer review were more likely to complete the course. This is those 37,000 people in the MOOC. I don't know, it would be interesting to know, and we're investigating whether these first two points hold for the face-to-face classes at Ohio State. Because there we're talking about more traditionally aged students. Most of the students in my classes are between ages 18 and 23. In fact, they're probably 18 and 21, most of them. And so we're interested now in knowing whether we can take the data that we're collecting from, in effect, professional writers, more mature writers. Very few of the participants in the MOOC were college age, something like 3% were college age participants, to see whether we can then apply and find receive similar findings from the students in the MOOC. I do think it's still, of the continuing questions, I do think it's interesting to ask the question of whether their assessments align with experts' assessments of the same assignments. And so we're also working this semester and we're having the pilot study students' essays read by faculty and graduate students in our program. And so we're going to see whether those assessments on those early drafts are comparable, or whether there's a sort of validity, inter rate, or reliability. I'm not certain what we might have found there. It's less valuable to me to think about that particular question than it is the question about helpfulness scores. What do students find most helpful in peer review? And to me, that's the more critical of those two questions. I mentioned earlier that one of the things I'm interested in is seeing whether we can take these various data points, in particular the peer review and helpfulness score, to see if we can identify what I'm calling strong tie learning. That is, can we identify behaviors, performances, interactions, activities, or analytics that contribute to strong tie learning? In other words, can I take something that we did in the MOOC, can I take discussion forums, or can I look at materials that we created, that we delivered online, pull them back into the classroom to make any kind of assumptions or test assumptions about what it means for students to contribute to strong Thai learning. We have here, these are just some data that are actually replicated in the final report that we have from the course. For example, you can see that we had interactions with videos, forum comments, the students submitting to WEX and so forth. These data are interesting to me as far as MOOC scope. They don't tell me a lot about what might happen in my face-to-face classroom or in a hybrid classroom. And we're going to continue to offer the MOOC in the fall this fall of 2014, and to see whether we can refine the instruction there in any ways that will make it a more productive environment for the students in the MOOC. But again, my questions have to do with what can I learn from that environment to bring back into my own classroom. In terms of the MOOC, I do have some continuing questions which I want to relate because these speaks back to the questions earlier on about what is the future of MOOCs in higher education. One of the big issues has to do with lurking, right, and completion percentages. In our course, something like only 2.3% of the participants actually completed the course, completed all the elements of the course. And you'll see in the popular media that this is an ongoing debate, like, well, if you only 2.3% of them complete, you know, what's the value of the course? And so we actually instituted a disenrollment survey, actually asking the people, why did you leave the course? Why did you not continue? What we found was, although they weren't among any of you here in this room, there were lurkers who came into the course, and we know that there were colleagues from the University of Nebraska, from Pitt, from a number of institutions who were just interested in seeing what a writing group looked like. And we really welcomed that. And the notion that, and I also want to question the notion of lurking as a problematic orientation to an online course, and MOOC in particular. I worked in calculus. I actually learned a little bit about calculus and often conversed with my daughter, who's a math major, right, a little bit more than I could before, so there's a value in that. But we were really interested in seeing whether we could gather data that would give us some insight into why people, especially in these early generation MOOCs, were leaving. And many of them were just, as you say, 20% really were just dropping in, and then another 51% had too much to do. There were things going on outside of the course that prevented them from completing it. And ours was a 10-week course, which was a long haul for everyone. Typically, research is showing us that MOOCs of 6 to 8 weeks see a higher percentage of completion. And then some data here on access to the different materials in the MOOC. So then we have some continuing questions again, as I mentioned earlier. What are the patterns across types of activities that characterize the experiences of successful students? If they were really into peer review, they were more inclined to finish the course. And so that suggests to me that peer review as the sort of central feature of a MOOC in particular is going to be critically important. And it will be critically important for us as we move forward. I think that's also the case for our face-to-face courses. If we recognize that peer review and self-reflection about rating are as critical as actually producing a text itself, then we need to continue to look at peer review and ask questions about its efficacy in the classroom. And under what circumstances is peer review more or less successful, and with what groups of students. There were a lot of reports early on in MOOCs, and this was something that we paid particular attention to. There were a lot of instances in which we were lurking in these courses, right? And so we were privy to a lot of the conversations that were going on. And in many of the courses, there was really what we found a disturbing trend among native English speakers in dismissing the responses from L2 learners. That once they perceived a peer reviewer to exhibit characteristics of characteristics of a second language learner, they would dismiss the peer response. Because how can I, as a native speaker of English, actually be productively engaged by someone who doesn't speak English as a first language? And so we were very aware of that as a tendency in early MOOCs, and so we quickly moved to talking about global Englishes. And the notion of global Englishes was a critical part of the MOOC. And I think it really did. We never saw anywhere in the MOOC a question or contestation between L1 and L2 learners where there was this debate about whether you're legitimately qualified to review my particular writing. And of course, with 70% of the population being L2 learners, it kind of made sense, right? That even the 30% of first language speakers were never dismissive of the work of their classmates and the other group participants. I can talk, I'm going to move here quickly past this particular slide, but it is the case that the MOOC has dramatically affected my understanding of the value of this connectivist pedagogy, as well as the research methodologies. And I'm happy to talk about how my own teaching has changed in the months since we completed the MOOC. So it's not just this one research project that I've been engaged in. But what we did, and these are just some examples of what the students did on themselves. What I talked about, if you're familiar with Ted Nelson's work from the 1980s, the notion of intertwingularity, which is now connectivist learning, right? These digital environments where students generate and receive and sort of contribute to the development of knowledge through social media, right? So Facebook, BuzzFeed, so on, all the different sources and how we come to understand is really distributed. It's a connectivist model. And so what the students in our class did on their own in the MOOC was they created these sort of unofficial sites, these, if you will, what's the term we use? Not backdoor learning, what's the term? It's not coming to me right offhand. The sort of underground, the underlife. If you remember years ago, Brooks' piece about the underlife of writing instruction, that we as teachers don't actually realize is happening in our classrooms. It's actually happening. It's happening on Google Communities in a MOOC, right? So, and it's happening on Facebook. It's actually happening on Facebook and Facebook classes. The students are kind of getting together and having conversations about your class on Facebook, but you just don't know because you're not their friend. So it's happening in all these places. And then we had a student who actually collected a number of YouTube videos that she had shared with the class as a way of extending the learning that she was having in the class and pointing people to, say, successful YouTube videos on how to write a persuasive argument, right? And she shared them with the students in the class. I'm going to do these are two videos. The first that we created to advertise the MOOC in January of 2013, and then the revised version that we did 2 months later, once we realized that the promotional video that we did in the beginning was way too stilted and not particularly inviting. So think of it this way. So in January of 2013, we had no idea who was going to be enrolling in our course, and we were assuming it was going to be sort of traditionally aged OSU type students, right? Or these very, AP students from Ohio high schools. And so we created a video that introduced the course rather than our orientation to. I'm just going to, and this is somewhat embarrassing, but I'm going to start with the first here and just give you a quick little video. And mostly what I want you to look at is the language, the demeanor, my sort of the physical orientation, where we shot the video, right, and what you would take away from that if you were a student in this course. And I think we have this microphone.
Hi, I'm Halasek, one of the instructors for Writing 2, Rhetorical Composing. Welcome to our course. We've designed Writing 2, Rhetorical Composition, with the student in mind, with you in mind. The student who's interested in learning more about the second level.
Like I said, a little embarrassing. It's all about the course content, a curriculum of the second level writing course.
Are all designed to help you.
This was produced by OSU OEE, Distance Education and Learning.
Second level writing course, and working into your major and thinking about the professional writing.
Talking about majors, talking about the undergraduate curriculum.
One thing this course will do is give you the opportunity to think about how writing is changing for the 21st century.
Writing 2 emphasizes critical reading, writing, and research strategies. You'll also come to understand the way in which digital media writing environments shape and are shaped by the processes of reading, writing, and critical research.
You'll have the chance to explore how writing combines with other media forms like sound, image, and video, and other surprising combinations.
That's right, I'm going to go back now and pick up the second, maybe the second of the two videos. Yes. And this is the revised version 2 months later. After we knew who was in the course. Okay, I'm going to go go back because you had them off. Oh shoot, no, can I? Oh, I want to go back to the beginning. Where's the mic?
Proposing emphasizes critical reading, writing, and research strategies, like learning how to craft an argument, learning how to speak to a specific audience. But you'll also
Focus
learn
is
how
no
reading,
longer
writing,
curriculum,
speaking,
but on
and using
rhetoric
images
and
provide you
products.
with a robust set of communication tools for today's world.
So in the 21st century, reading of writing has changed in very fundamental ways. It's no longer just about marks on a piece of paper, but it involves combining images and audio and still images and moving images in various combinations. In this course, you'll get the opportunity to think about that in a little more detail.
I think one of the most exciting things about rhetorical composing is WEX, which is the Writers Exchange. It's in WEX that we're going to provide you with training for providing feedback to the other writers in the class on the writing that they're producing. I think this is something that writers see real value in, but they're sometimes just uncertain about how to provide good feedback. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about that in the class. And we think that not only will the feedback you receive be really important to you producing good writing, but we think that this is going to provide you an opportunity to think differently about your own writing. And by providing feedback to other people, you're going to become a stronger writer. And WEX is really going to help you do that.
You know, one of the things that I like most about this course is that we're going to give you the opportunity to level up, to publish some of your writing.
That was our
in different
gamification.
venues, and to see how it looks when it's sent out there in the real world and other people get a chance to see it. We're also going to give you some real information on your own performance vis-a-vis that of other writers in the course. And we think you're going to find that very useful as a source of instruction.
Come join us!
So my point in sharing these with you is to demonstrate really how differently we began to conceive of the course after we found out who had enrolled in the course. And that was a lesson for me as a teacher, that I'm not only just-in-time learning, but to think about structuring my courses in such a way that I speak to the needs of the students in my class, whether it's by major or by high school preparation, whether it's by language proficiency, regionalism, however we want to talk about that. And so this was really instructive for me personally, and I think that the other members of the course would say that's the case as well. So now we've implemented not only the peer review system in our pilots for the second level writing course 2367, but we've also instituted discussion forums, which I will say on the Coursera platform in the MOOC was a spectacular system. It's really sort of social media oriented, it's threaded discussion, and those were some of the most robust spaces where we saw learning and community being developed, learning taking place and community being developed in the courses, and I'm happy to talk about the discussion forums as well. But I really, and to sort of draw to some conclusion here about the constructivist methodology, we've continued to work alongside the participants in our MOOC. Whenever we publish, including the Invasion of Loops, which you referred to earlier, which actually came out, I think, yesterday, and it's the most horrendous sort of cover of a book I've ever seen, because it actually has this like spacecraft and alien on the front, which is a little bit problematic from my perspective. The metaphor is taking a little bit too far. But we continue to collaborate with the participants from the paper. I did this blog post you just indicated here, and I worked with the members, co-authored the blog post in fact with the members, so the members from the MOOC and so forth. So that's a part of our constructivist methodology that we continue with. And then I want to close with another short YouTube video from one of the participants in the MOOC, and then open it for conversation about any of the elements, peer review and so forth, that you might want to talk about with MOOCs in particular. But this was produced by Lenny Spooner, who's one of the participants in the MOOC. Lenny, I don't know that she says it in this particular part. Lenny is a practicing professional. She's Canadian, and she is in effect homebound because she's caring for two chronically ill parents, and so very rarely ever gets out of the home. And so the MOOC was sort of the community that developed. She's a wonderful writer and writes regularly as part of her work. But this was her her farewell, her thank you to us at the end of the movie. And so I'll just let her speak here. Yeah, it's a little Star Trek-esque, but it's valuable. To us, this was so such an encouraging moment to have a student actually produce something like this as a video thank you. But I think that shouldn't be anomalous. I think that we can teach writing, and we can teach writing in face-to-face, hybrid, online, or MOOC environments, and sort of enliven this kind of response to our students and from our students, and that's what I'm hopeful for. I'm an idealist, but I really do think that the work that we did in the MOOC and the kind of data that we have will move us productively toward a new orientation toward teaching writing, and in particular toward peer review in our face-to-face classrooms. Thanks, and I am happy to answer whatever questions you have.
So I'll let you just call on people.
Certainly.
I'm thinking about Elizabeth and the grouchy respondent, the grouchy peer reviewer, calling her writing pretentious. And it seems to me plausible that that Elizabeth was ascending discourse community, that she was not producing a style that was familiar to that peer reviewer, and calling it pretentious, and then having her, kind of internalize that and say, okay, he's right. I mean, I'm concerned about her.
About Elizabeth?
About Elizabeth.
Yeah, perhaps a little context for the assignment would be helpful, because the context of the assignment asks, this critical synthesis, asks the writers to understand their peers as their audience. So it's from that perspective that the peer found the writing pretentious, that it didn't speak to the audience that, in this case, Elizabeth had identified.
And so would she then revise to enable a certain folksiness to be able to?
I don't know, because I haven't seen her revision yet, because this was a piece that she just wrote about 3 weeks ago.
Right,
so
but if she did do that, I mean, would you be distressed by that, or would you say, like, okay, she learned something really valuable about
Right. I think if she meant folksy, I would find it maybe problematic, because I wouldn't think that that tone would be particularly helpful in the critical synthesis essay either. But I would hope that Elizabeth would now be in a position to ask herself, not only with that data point, but all of those others, to ask herself, in a sort of self-reflective fashion, what kinds of decisions should I be making about the tone or the level of sophistication of the language that I'm using. For me, that self-reflective step is the most important step. In some ways, I'm less, if you will, interested in what it might become at this point in the semester, right? Because I'm still only week 10. We still have 4 or 5 weeks left in the semester, and 2 more sets of peer reviews that are going to take place. And so I'm interested at the end of the semester in the portfolio, when Elizabeth does her final reflection for the course, not just in this piece of writing, but how she makes decisions about that element and others over the course of the term. I don't want folksy from Elizabeth. but I do want her to recognize that there are other decisions that she can make as a writer that might be more effective in constructing the critical synthesis essay for a particular audience.
So, and this is kind of a related question. So the question of helpfulness, why do we think? I mean, I don't have like a real deep skepticism, but just kind of principle. Why do we think that the ones that you think are helpful actually are helpful?
You don't, well, so then the question is, what do we mean by helpful, right?
Yeah,
What
so,
do they
so that's, imagine two sort of forms of helpful. One is like someone who says something, I mean, the easy one, which would not be distracting, pretentious, the easy one would be, I just think this was so wonderful, so that's helpful. Or kind of criticism of the student can process in a way that seems to the student to be useful. And it may well be that actually what the research would show would be that the ones that seem to the student to be useful really are, by some other judgment, presumably the instructors, also useful.
That's potentially.
But it's
yes,
also possible that the ones that seem to the student to be useful would not, in the instructor's judgment, be all that useful at all. So I guess there are two. So I guess, yeah, that's I don't think you guys are not being too quantitative. I haven't thought that's a research question. I was just going by intuition, which is not to trust the student. But the thing is that a kind of research question that can come out of this, and how would you go about sort of actually answering it?
I think the additional data point we would need to have for something like that would be for instructors to assess the helpfulness themselves of all of those vast numbers of student responses, peer reviews. So I look at a piece of writing, I look at Elizabeth's essay, and then I read the peer reviews and I assess them on the basis of how helpful I think they are. Right, so that would be a data point. So then, is there an alignment between what I see as helpful what the student did, and if there's not an alignment, to what question we then ask? I didn't want to use a rubric for helpfulness because I didn't want to impose my sense of what was going to be helpful.
No, I totally see this.
Yeah, and well, that I'm glad that you do, because that wasn't a shared opinion among folks that we've talked
Well,
about.
it'd be useful to getting information.
Yes, yes. And so either of those possibilities is likely, and we may find no sort of simple set of correlations between helpfulness as the students understood it or about revision. The next sort of data point for me is what happens in revision. So when Elizabeth elects to revise this piece, do I see a change in word length, characters per word, or in the question and reading score and so forth? And if I do, and it's assessed again, is it